Hello everyone, I'm Klaudia Czerwińska. Welcome to World News Tonight here on TVP World. Tonight we will be taking a deep dive into how US President Joe Biden's resignation and endorsement of Kamala Harris could potentially affect Central and Eastern Europe and what we could expect in terms of international politics. Later, I will be joined by Voice of America's The White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara. However, before that happens, let's take a look at the latest headlines. We're in touch with both sides of the political spectrum, says Poland's foreign minister in response to the recent events in the US. EU foreign ministers divided over boycott of Hungarian presidency. Slovakia has already received its first F-16s. Ukraine is still waiting. Joe Biden's withdrawal from the U.S. presidential race has come as both a pleasant and somewhat concerning surprise to many across the world. Marek Steele has more on Central Europe's outlook on the U.S. president's decision.
Who sits in the White House is of paramount importance to NATO and its members on the eastern flank. Warsaw's residents, for the most part, seem to have taken Biden's decision to withdraw from the race with relief.
It's good that Biden resigned. Everyone has their dusk of life, don't they?
This is a chance for a candidate who will support Ukraine in the war with Russia, who will support the eastern flank of NATO. Joe Biden's withdrawal does bring a lot of hope to our hearts, but we should be grateful for what he has done for us.
Biden has done a lot for Poland during his term in office. Under his presidency, the United States established its first permanent garrison of troops in Poland. A record number of over 10,000 soldiers are currently stationed there.
Dear President Joe Biden, you have taken many difficult decisions thanks to which Poland, America and the world are safer and democracy stronger.
Warsaw is certain that the election will not impact relations between itself and Washington.
It's the perfect time with respect to the election calendar in the United States and Europe's current undertakings to convince U.S. politicians and public opinion that Europe has pulled itself together. We spend more on defense and we are not a stowaway when it comes to supporting Ukraine.
Since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, NATO's European members have redefined their approach to security.
In the more immediate term, I hope that key European states and the remaining period of the Biden administration will give all of the capacity that Ukraine needs and that they're willing and able to give, and that capacity should be allowed to be used to the fullest extent.
With all NATO eastern flank countries spending more on defense than the required 2% threshold, what now remains uncertain is how far future support for Ukraine will go.
Now that Joe Biden has dropped out of the U.S. presidential race, Kamala Harris has become the front-runner to replace him on the ticket. Prominent Democrats and donors are already rallying behind her, but one top Democrat has yet to endorse her. Let's look at what lies ahead of Harris in her bid to become the Democrat nominee.
Biden's decision to drop out of the race hadn't come as a surprise to some. The president had been facing pressure to do so from Democratic lawmakers and donors alike for weeks. Now the question is whether Harris can secure her party's nomination. She has received endorsements from many prominent Democrats, including Bill and Hillary Clinton, several senators and representatives, and even Joe Biden himself. But Barack Obama remains silent. Scott Lucas, international politics professor at University College Dublin, explained the possible reasoning behind this move in an exclusive TVP World interview.
They have to be careful not to make it look like this is a coronation of their candidate. They have to make it look like Kamala Harris is one amongst a number of very capable politicians and activists at national, state, and local level.
Many believe that replacing a candidate so late in the race comes with a significant disadvantage, and selecting a candidate other than Kamala Harris would make the short campaign even more frantic. Harris has access to Biden's $96 million war chest and can run on her track record as vice president. She is, however, also associated with what her critics have deemed as Biden administration failures, the border crisis and the failure to codify a right to abortion.
Fundamental freedoms under assault. Freedom from fear, violence, and harm. Freedom to vote, to live, to learn, to control one's own body.
Polling shows Kamala faring better than Biden, but still not well enough to beat Donald Trump. A recent YouGov poll shows Harris at 48%, 3 percentage points behind the Republican nominee.
She has the advantage of being the first Black woman vice president, the first Asian American vice president. And I think that's important when you talk about issues that will be of importance to minorities and especially women's rights, which may be the lead issue. Harris has one other advantage. She's a former prosecutor. And the narrative of prosecutor versus convicted felon, prosecutor versus man who tried to prevent the orderly transfer of power, that's a pretty powerful narrative.
Harris's ability to beat Trump can be bolstered by her VP choice, someone who can appeal to voters who do not find her convincing on her own. Biden's resignation galvanized the Democrat base and reset the landscape. A race that seemed to have been slipping more and more into the bag for the Republicans will now likely be decided by key battleground states.
Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski met with other EU foreign ministers in Brussels. During their talks, Sikorski called for the lifting of restrictions imposed by EU countries on the use of long-range weapons by Ukraine.
Sytuacja w Ukrainie jest dramatyczna.
As you all well know, the situation in Ukraine is dire. This was our first meeting since the barbaric attack on the Children's Hospital in Kiev. Because of this, I have appealed to my fellow ministers to abolish the limits that had been imposed on the use of long-range weapons, so that Ukraine will be able to prevent such attacks in the future. This would allow it to strike the aircraft which launch such missiles and target the airports from which these planes take off. It seems to me that this would entirely be self-defense, which is legal under international law. The defense of children's hospitals is not an escalation.
Several crucial issues were discussed at the EU foreign ministers' meeting. After Viktor Orban's recent visit to China and Russia drew the ire of many in Europe, there have been talks on whether Hungary would suffer any repercussions. The EU foreign policy chief has announced that the next foreign and defense minister meetings will be held in Brussels and not in Budapest due to Orban's stance on Ukraine. Sasha Farbach has more in his report on today's Foreign Affairs Council.
Unacceptable. Those are the words of High Rep Borrell as all EU foreign leaders gather in Brussels to talk about many things, including, of course, what to do about Hungary. Remember that imminent and continuing boycott of some EU member states, not sending their ministers to any of these informal ministerials. The Commission joined in that call last week, but it's not unified. There's certain countries. In fact, if we go back also to the energy meeting, which took place some weeks ago, only six member states out of 27 were able to send certain ministers there, and out of that call to boycott after what people are indignified and angry at Mr. Orban taking over and using the platform of the rotating presidency to his advantage. Now let's see what Mr. Borrell said as he arrived in Brussels this morning.
Accusing the European Union to be the country or the union that pushes for war. This is completely unacceptable. The European Union is supporting Ukraine and willing to finish this war on the basis of the United Nations Charter. We will discuss about how member states evaluate this position by a country who is at the same time the rotatory presidency of the European Union.
That boycott might continue. As we've already heard, the Austrians are not on board with this at all, including the Slovaks. The Dutch also will be abstaining from this boycott. But then again, on the other side, a lot very much from the Nordic countries, Poland as well included, will not be sending on that ministerial level anyone, including, as I remind you, as the Commission as well included. But other things on the agenda as well, what to do about Ukraine, continuing those billions that are still being blocked, and also floating out 8 countries before this meeting took place about reassessing that EU-Syria connection, potentially floating an idea of a new EU representative to Syria to deal with migration and potentially sending people back. And that's being floated here amongst many other topics. But big question is, what will happen? Will this boycott widen or will it dissipate? More on that in future. Stay tuned. Sasha Farbach for TVP World.
At today's meeting of EU foreign ministers in Brussels, Czech Foreign Minister Jan Lipavsky announced that 100,000 rounds of much-needed ammunition will be delivered to war-torn Ukraine in July and August under a Czech-led initiative to purchase ammunition from around the world.
The Czech foreign minister said that the ammunition shipments to Ukraine will accelerate in September. Lipavsky also said that the initiative will be continued in 2025. A total of 18 countries have joined the Czech-led initiative, 15 of which have already fulfilled their commitments and made their contribution. They have donated over 1.6 billion euros to purchase artillery ammunition for Ukraine, which has been repelling Russia's full-scale invasion for over 2 years now. According to the minister, this means that there are enough funds to deliver 500,000 rounds of ammunition to Ukraine by the end of the year.
For the first time ever, the European Union has decided to provide financial support to the Armenian armed forces. Yerevan will receive €10 million worth of aid from the so-called European Peace Facility.
The EU's foreign minister made the decision in Brussels this morning. The assistance is intended to increase the logistic capabilities of the Armenian armed forces, including their effectiveness of protecting civilians in crisis and emergency situations. Most recently, Armenia found itself facing such a situation when Azerbaijan launched its military operation in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2023. In addition, the assistance aims to boost Armenian military interoperability in the event of a possible future participation in international military missions and operations, including under the auspices of the EU. The European Peace Facility, established in March 2021, is an instrument aimed at enhancing the EU's ability to prevent conflicts, build and preserve peace, and strengthen international security and stability. Previously, the EPF took measures to support the armed forces of Moldova, Ghana, and Albania, among others.
On July 22, 1942, Germans began the so-called Großaktion in the Warsaw Ghetto. It involved the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews from Warsaw to the extermination camp in Treblinka. A remembrance march in their honor took place today in Warsaw. Our reporter Ovidiusz Nicieja was on site and sent us this report.
The mass deportation of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto began right here, exactly 82 years ago. This place is called the Umschlagplatz, or in German, it means the transit square. It's here that hundreds of thousands of men, women and children from the Warsaw Ghetto, which was located in this part of the city, were loaded on trains and taken to death camps. It is estimated that just in the death camp in Treblinka, 300,000 Jews were murdered by the Nazis. And today, a commemorative march took place in honor of the victims of the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto.
As every year, we just want to state that we do remember about those who were murdered in Treblinka after being deported from the Warsaw Ghetto. So over 300,000 people were deported from Warsaw Ghetto between 22nd of July and 21st of September 1942. And most of them are nameless. We don't know their names. And we want to state that despite this fact, that we don't know nothing about them, we cannot tell their stories, we want to say that we do remember about them.
We're handing out ribbons with the most popular Jewish names in Warsaw before the war, and we're doing it to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust, and the Warsaw Ghetto especially.
The first Remembrance March on the 22nd of July was organized 13 years ago, and it was believed to be the first event in Poland dedicated solely to the civilian victims of the Holocaust, whereas other events commemorate the Jewish Combat Organization and uprisings. This one is dedicated solely to the civilian, largely unnamed victims of the Holocaust. From Warsaw for TVP World, Ovidiusz Nicieja.
The Slovakian Air Force has received its first batch of F-16 fighter jets. Although this one includes only 2 aircraft, 12 more are already on their way. Ukraine, meanwhile, is still awaiting its first set of F-16s.
Slovakia has entered a new age of military aviation. With the acquisition of their first F-16s, the Slovakian Air Force has received a serious upgrade from its old Soviet-designed jets. The deal was signed back in 2018, when Slovakia ordered 14 F-16s in the newest version, Block 70/72, for €1.6 billion.
This is a significant step for Slovakia in its own defense, as an important NATO ally, and as an important step forward in the bilateral relationship.
In the past, the MiG-29s were the flagship fighter jets of the Slovakian Air Force. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Bratislava officially retired its fleet of MiGs and gave over a dozen of them to Kyiv.
We provide the MiG-29 to Ukraine to protect its civilians from the many bombs that fall on their residents and their houses.
Ukraine is now anxiously awaiting the very same technological upgrade that Slovakia made today. The first F-16s are to reach Kyiv as soon as this summer.
I think it's long overdue. I mean, the U.S. has been dragging its feet on the F-16s for reasons I'm not clear on. I understand there's been claims of training. There has been technical work going on for some time that I've been aware of. But nevertheless, I'm looking forward to that happening and think that we should have done this at least 6 months to a year ago.
The decision to give Ukraine F-16s was made last year. After a year of intense training, Ukrainian pilots are ready to operate them. But first, the aircraft must actually arrive in Ukraine.
Today, the second group of Polish athletes took the Olympic oath. What's more, this morning, French President Emmanuel Macron visited the Olympic Village. Let's take a closer look at the preparations ahead of the Games.
With just 4 days left until the Paris Olympics, another group of Polish athletes received their official nominations and took their vows ahead of the Games today. The event took place at the Polish Olympic Committee headquarters in Warsaw. The final Olympic oath ceremony for the Polish athletes will take place tomorrow, and it will see the largest group of competitors officially nominated. The Polish athletes have their goals for the Games set.
Every competition we enter, we aim for gold. Otherwise, why go at all? Wish us to have fun, so we don't forget that we are doing this for the love of the sport, so that we don't treat it as a job, but as a hobby, as something we love to do.
Poland's track and field legend Anita Włodarczyk will carry the Polish flag together with Przemysław Zamojski during the opening ceremony.
It is a great honor to be entrusted with this task. I will fulfill my duty together with Anita Włodarczyk.
Today, a little less than a week after it was opened, French President Emmanuel Macron visited the Olympic Village.
This morning, we reviewed the most sensitive security aspects of the opening ceremony. I want to acknowledge the immense amount of work that has been done.
The opening ceremony will take place this Friday, although some sports competitions will start as early as Wednesday. Polish fans are eagerly awaiting the volleyball, tennis, climbing, fencing, and athletics competition, where Polish athletes are expected to win medals. Unfortunately, Polish tennis player Hubert Hurkacz announced today that he will not participate in the Games due to an injury he sustained at the Wimbledon tennis tournament on July 4th.
And now we're moving away from Paris, away from the Olympics and the oath ceremony, as well as our Polish athletes, which are going to take part in the Games. It's now time to switch gears a little bit and take a closer look at the situation within the last 24 hours when it comes to the U.S. politics. And for that, I'm joined by my next guest, Patsy Widakuswara, White House Bureau Chief, Voice of America. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining me today, especially with everything that's been happening. I suppose you must be very busy.
A little bit, just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Let's dive straight into it. So we have to work with an assumption that Vice President Harris is going to be the next Democratic nominee. So let's keep that in mind. We do not know that yet. There is a lot of support from senior Democrats as of now. We're still looking at the latest developments. And let's start from the very beginning, from the announcement by U.S. President Joe Biden that sent ripples through the world. Do you think that this was inevitable? Was there any way or any scenario in which this would not take place?
Well, President Joe Biden said himself that there are a couple of things that would make him reconsider running for re-election. Number one is the most dire of political pollings, and number two is if there's some sort of health condition, and number three is if, in his words, Lord Almighty comes out and says that he wants Joe Biden to step down. And in a sense, perhaps those three things came together over the weekend when his closest advisors came to show him the latest polls, not polls from other sources, but the Democratic National Committee's own polls that shows really he is bleeding support since his weak performance at the June 27th debate. And then also at the same time, he is, of course, sick with COVID. So he's been in isolation in his Delaware vacation home since Wednesday, I believe. And so, those two factors perhaps made Joe Biden finally realize that the end is near. And so he made this decision quite late on Saturday evening. He didn't tell anybody except his closest advisors. He didn't even tell his staff until 1 minute before the announcement came out at 1:46 p.m. Eastern time in Washington, here in the East Coast in the United States. So that's on Sunday. So since then, we've seen a lot of things happening. We've seen Democrats coalesce behind Kamala Harris, even though, as you say, she is not a foregone conclusion. She is the most logical choice at this point, and we can go into why. But certainly, in the 24 hours or so since the announcement that Joe Biden is stepping aside and endorsing Kamala Harris, Democrats have raised more than $50 million. This is Kamala Harris and the Biden-Harris campaign, $50 million just in less than 24 hours. And then another group, what's called a super PAC here in the United States, a political action committee, $150 million for Kamala Harris. This is, of course, on top of the war chest that the Biden-Harris camp already has, which Kamala Harris is entitled to use if she does become the top of the ticket.
But don't you think that the Democrats actually moved quite late when it comes to that? I'm aware of the fact that President Biden decided to make that statement, make that announcement without the knowledge of his closest ones. But do you think that this change is coming too late, especially considering that the convention, the Democratic convention in Chicago, is going to take place on the 19th of August, and we are not so far away from the actual election itself?
Oh, absolutely. This is absolute crunch time for Democrats. All of this happened since June 27th, the week debate performance, and then more and more Democrats saying that we should make a decision, President Biden should step down, and so on. But he, waited until over the weekend to announce that he was going to step aside. And of course, nothing could happen unless and until Joe Biden said that he is stepping aside. And so now the focus for Democrats is to use this less than 1 month period to consolidate themselves and unite behind a potential nominee. Right now, it looks like Kamala Harris, but again, it's not a foregone conclusion because this all has to be decided when the Democratic National Convention happens. So in the U.S., in our system, it's not a Democratic one-man, one-vote system where I go into the polling booth and vote for Kamala, for Biden-Harris ticket, which I do. But in reality, what I'm doing is I'm voting for a delegate from my state to go to the national convention and give their vote to whatever ticket won the primary or the caucus contest over the summer. So that's going to happen in August, where about 3,900 delegates are already pledging their votes for Joe Biden. Now, of course, Biden endorsing Harris would mean something politically, but in reality, the delegates can nominate anybody they want. And so what's happening between now and then is Democrats trying to coalesce and unite behind Kamala Harris.
So these are the technicalities which are incredibly important, but I would like to, again, work on the assumption that Vice President Harris is actually going to be able to become the nominee. If elected, what do you think the major differences would be when it comes to the foreign policy style between President Joe Biden and Vice President Harris, and how would it actually affect the Central and Eastern Europe? Because this is what we focused on today earlier in the program.
Well, so far, the short answer to that is so far we don't know, because everything that Kamala Harris has said on foreign policy has been a reflection of the Biden-Harris administration. So we can assume that there will be a continuation of the Joe Biden on foreign policy if there is a Harris administration. We can assume the same on Ukraine. We can assume the same on Israel, for example. But the fact of the matter is, outside of being vice president, we don't have any kind of foreign policy record on Kamala Harris. So this is, again, an assumption that there will be a continuation if she wins.
Do you think this is a gamble for the Democrats that would be supposed to voting for Vice President Harris, and how would it actually affect the vote inside of the party?
Oh, absolutely. This is a gamble, but this is a gamble that the Democrats have decided to take. And it seems like there is strong support for that, both in terms of the political support from Democratic lawmakers and leadership, and also party apparatus in states and local and so on, and also just in terms of the money that we have discussed. So there's definitely a new energy, a new excitement coming from the Democratic Party. The big question, of course, is whether Harris will be able to beat Donald Trump come November. And that much is still a very much open question. And this is something that Democrats will, of course, work on their messaging coming forward. I think one of the narrative that Democrats will try to shape is the fact that Donald Trump is a convicted, has been slapped with so many felony charges, versus Kamala Harris, who used to be a prosecutor, who's strong or who has strong backgrounds on criminal justice. So that's perhaps one angle that they will try to put forward. But again, it is a gamble, and we won't know until the dice is thrown.
Definitely. A big difference, a big contrast in between the two. How do you think that Vice President Harris would actually shape her foreign policy? You mentioned that we do not know that yet, but based on the signals that she's given us before, for example, in Munich, what would be the support for Ukraine? Because the U.S. so far and the Democratic government has been absolutely vital when it comes to support for Ukraine.
So far, there is not a single sliver of daylight between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden when it comes to Ukraine. She is deeply supportive of Ukraine the same way Joe Biden has been. And if we look at her team, her foreign policy team, the people that are in the vice president's office, for example, I see the same names. These are people that used to be a National Security Council under Joe Biden. Some of them have transferred to her office. So in terms of the advisors, who will she be listening to, at least for the first short term, if she does become president? I don't foresee, or analysts don't see foresee any kind of differences in terms of policy. But naturally, of course, she will expand and grow on her own if she does become the president. But obviously, that's something that we cannot predict right now.
As we're looking at the CEE, we also need to remember that the challenges go far beyond what we see in Ukraine taking place right now. Obviously, there are different conflicts across the globe, different issues and different challenges due to the very volatile nature of the times that we live in. How do you think she could possibly, what would be her stance on the foreign policy and the conflicts that are taking place elsewhere in the world?
I think this will be a really key point of attack from Republicans by saying that Kamala Harris is untested in foreign policy. I mean, she is not Joe Biden, who has been in the Senate in politics for 50 years, has extensive decades of experience in the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, has met probably every single world leaders in the world, alive and dead. Harris has had quite a bit of a foreign policy portfolio during her tenure as a vice president. She has been charged with immigration in the southern border. She was charged with Asia-Pacific affairs in terms of countering China, particularly in approaching ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries. She's gone, as you said, to Munich security conferences. So she's not completely foreign or untested in terms of these policies regarding, world affairs and conflicts and so on. But the fact of the matter is that she has been an executor of those policies, which were Joe Biden's policies. So, of course, one thing that Republicans will probably aim for is saying that she's untested, while Trump has already had his very, classic, distinct, very strong projection of foreign policy, which is America first.
Last but not least, very shortly, my final question. We heard from Scott Lucas here on TVP World in an exclusive interview that he gave to our channel earlier today, and he said something very interesting. He said that America has to be careful not to make it look like a coronation. The Democrats have to make sure that they're not going to make that endorsement look like a coronation of Vice President Kamala Harris. Does this change make it easier, you think, or perhaps more difficult for Donald Trump to win this upcoming election?
It's absolutely true that Democrats need to avoid the appearance of being undemocratic in coronating Kamala Harris if there is a viable alternative for a nominee. If there is a viable candidate that raise their hands and say, I want to claim the nomination for president on top of the Democratic ticket. But so far there hasn't been. These are what I'm saying is a viable candidate, not a vanity candidate who says that they want to, but really have no political support. In terms of the chances against Donald Trump, I mean, right now the pollings are, I wouldn't trust the pollings at this point because, it's still very fresh. But in some polls, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is pretty much neck to neck. The point, I think, what the Democrats want to underline is that Harris is faring better compared to Biden versus Trump in past weeks, and they really want to push that forward to make that gap grow wider. That Harris might be better positioned to beat Trump.
And with that, we unfortunately will have to end this interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Patsy Widakuswara, Voice of America's White House Bureau Chief. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
Pleasure is all mine as always. Thank you. And so this was all the latest news on World News Tonight. Please remember to join us for more latest news and features here on TVP World. Good night.